Okay, so a couple other things in good reserve design talked about maintaining connections between different protected areas. And this is going to be important for maintaining those meta-population dynamics. So if the species declines and is extirpated from one area, if we have these networks of protected areas with all these connections, then they might be able to be recolonized by that species on their own without any intervention from people. That is the best scenario. That's what we want to be able to happen. Similarly, with climate change, as the climate changes, if we have all these connected protected areas, then species might be able to move towards their suitable climates on their own without any assistance from people. So we know that there is fragmentation and small size, and these networks can limit the effects of this by providing an area for species to be able to move to. As I said, it accommodates metapopulations. It's also effective for cooperation between public and private lands. So if we can maintain good relations between private companies or private individuals with the protected areas, then they might be more tolerant of species that we're interested in conserving on their land. So one way of doing this is habitat corridors. These are strips of protected areas connecting larger protected areas. We also mentioned before stepping stones, these smaller patches in between larger protected areas to act as a stepping stone to get from one protected area to the next. They're really important for migration and dispersal, and if you'll remember, this is important part of the theory of island biogeography, making sure we maintain biodiversity. And the width depends on the species you're targeting. So you might not need a very wide corridor for a small animal, like maybe a salamander, but you might need a really wide corridor for something like an elk. One of the primary barriers between protected areas are roads. And one way of dealing with this are underpasses and overpasses to help wildlife get across roads. So this shows some underpasses. Some of them are just little culverts that go underneath the road. They can help water drain off the road as well. But they're just like a tunnel so that things can go underneath. And so this shows a toad. They've installed, these pictures are all from camera traps installed right outside of these underpasses or inside the underpasses to see what types of wildlife are actually using them. So we see toads will use them. This is a turtle going under a road. Turtles are killed in very, very large numbers every year trying to cross roads to get from, especially if they're aquatic turtles, to get from wetlands where they live to sandy areas where they want to lay their eggs. And we lose a ton of turtles every year from this. You can see here's a raccoon using one. They found in Australia that koalas don't like to walk on the ground. So they installed a tree branch for them to climb across, so it seemed more like they were climbing through the trees, and that got the koalas to use the underpasses. Here you can see some turkeys using some in Florida. If you make a really big underpass, large mammals will even use them. And so this shows elephants and moose in different parts of the world using these very large underpasses. Part of what's needed to make this effective is to have a fence along the road that funnels them towards this underpass. So you can kind of see that here there's a fence with barbed wire on top trying to prevent these large animals from going towards the road and potentially having a collision with a vehicle. There are also overpasses, and these are overpasses made just for wildlife. You're obviously familiar with overpasses for cars, so that cars can go over the highway without stopping traffic. This one is in Banff National Park in Canada. And it goes across the Trans-Canada Highway, and there are 41 of these. And these, so there are fences and barriers along the forest here where an animal will hit the fence, come this way, and then is funneled over overpass to get to the other side if that's their goal. And they've planted it with vegetation so that the animals feel like they're still in a forest or some natural vegetation, which is designed to help facilitate their movement across the road. There are some types of species that are scared to go in open spaces, so having the tree cover helps them be more motivated or less timid about using this type of feature. And so this one is big enough that it can be used by bears, elk, and mountain lions. And so this is a picture of grizzly bears using one of these overpasses, and they found that grizzly bears with cubs prefer these overpasses when compared with underpasses and tunnels, and I think it's because they can see predators more easily when they're going over the road than going through a small tunnel. They're worried that they might be ambushed by a predator if they're going through a dark tunnel, and they don't want to lose their cubs. So this is how they've made these particularly effective. And if you look really closely, you can see the fence here that's designed to keep them from accidentally walking off the edge. Has anybody heard of Christmas Island? It is an island, and it's famous for this major migration by these bright red land crabs. And so these are unusual crabs. They're terrestrial crabs that live in the forest, but when they breed, they have to go to the ocean to lay their eggs. And so this shows all these crabs trying to lay their eggs into the ocean. But when it's time for them to do this migration, there are so many crabs that they cover up the roads. This shows a picture of all the eggs from the crabs after they've laid them. So there's tons and tons and tons of these crabs. And so for a while they were having to close roads. This is, if you can see, there is a car here and a fence here. They're trying to funnel the crabs along the side of the road. They were closing roads because you can imagine with this many crabs, cars driving across it would just kill tons and tons and tons of crabs. So they decided to design an overpass just for these crabs so that the populations wouldn't go down. And these are kind of a tourism. I mean, a lot of people think it's really cool to go see these crabs migrate. And so they built these overpasses and underpasses to help the crabs go across the road. So it's not just for big furry things like grizzly bears. People have worked on, they're trying to conserve these crabs, and so they've designed these other overpasses as well. Other barriers can be significant conservation problems. Dams are really problematic for migratory fish. So particularly things like salmon that need to migrate back and forth between small freshwater streams and the ocean. Also, eels do this as well. In order to breed and live out their lives, they've been doing these migrations for a really long time. And then we put dams in the way and they can't get over the dam. It's too big. They're used to hopping up rocks and small waterfalls and things like that. And so people have built what are called fish ladders. And so you can see they start at the bottom and they're trying to get up the dam, and they go up and they go around and around and around till they make it all the way up. Some of them are more like little waterfalls and they have to kind of jump up the steps, but they're used to doing jumping up these small steps with like boulders and things like that. And so these are called fish ladders, and they've been really important for helping salmon get around dams in the Pacific Northwest. So this shows an example where we have some different protected areas, kind of a meta-population scheme here. And this is before fragmentation occurred. And then people needed to put in a road. So this shows this white area with the dotted line. This is the road that needed to be put in. And you can see that we lost a fragment here. And they put in an overpass, and the idea was to maintain connectivity. This shows the effect zone of the road, this kind of tan area, And so what they've done is try to have some compensation sites. So they lost some sites, but they wanted to add in some other habitat patches to help make these stepping stones to help maintain this metapopulation structure. And so you can see that's what they've tried to do to try to compensate for the fact that this road is now in the way of this metapopulation network. So when you're thinking about these corridors and we're thinking about protected area design, you have to kind of think about the whole metapopulation structure if it's a species that has that, and think about these corridors so that we can make it as effective as possible. So what are some drawbacks of corridors? So there's a lot of concern that wildlife won't use them. They're expensive to put in, and if the wildlife aren't going to use them, then why spend the money to do it? They're really expensive when the road has already been built. They're most cost effective when they're included when new roads are built. So retrofitting the road is harder than putting it in and when the road is put in the first place. There's also concern about the movement of pest species or diseases. So connecting areas that didn't used to be connected might facilitate the movement of invasive species, or a disease might spread from one area to another that wasn't present before.